Welcome to the League of Women Voters presentation today. My name is Christy Bardenhagen, and I'm Vice President of the League of Women Voters, Leelanau County. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan political organization that encourages three things: informed and active participation in government, increasing understanding of major public policy issues, and influencing public policy through education and advocacy. We never ever support or oppose candidates or parties. Men and women who are 18 years of age and American citizens may join the League. The Leelanau League currently has 130 members, of which 30% are men. More information on the League may be found at our website, LWVLC.org, or we have information on the table outside the door. Dues are $60 a year for an individual or $90 for a family membership. Membership applications can be found online and also on the table. Today, the League hosts a forum entitled Early Childhood Intervention Improves Public Health. I want to thank Sue Miller, the chair of the Early Childhood Needs and Services Committee, and the many others on that committee that organized this event. After the presentation, we'll take a short break and then conduct our business meeting. Members are encouraged to stay and participate. Non-members are welcome to stay and observe. Now, Fran Eckerson from the Board and Early Childhood Needs and Services Committee will tell us about today's presentation.
Thank you for coming out on this beautiful day. We have two wonderful speakers. How's that? Okay. All right, so I'm going to introduce our speakers. I also want to let you know that there are note cards and pencils on every table, and we will be taking questions afterwards. The speakers will be taking questions, so feel free to write a question on the note card, and hopefully we have a runner that will pick them up. Yes? Yes. Oh, good. Okay. So just hold your note card up in the air and it will be picked up. Okay. So I would like to introduce our speakers, and let's start with Shenandoah Shefalo. She is a survivor of the foster care system, a graduate of Michigan State University.
Go green.
I'm sorry?
Go green,
Go
right?
green. Yes, we need some green. She holds a Bachelor of Arts with a major in interdisciplinary studies and social sciences. She is a Core Essentials graduate from Coach U and a member of the Foster Leaders Movement. And I'm going to put my glasses on. It's like, geez, why can't I say you don't have your glasses on? Shen is a sought-after speaker on topics surrounding youth and foster care. She has been a featured speaker locally, nationally, and internationally. She is the author of Garbage Bag Suitcase, and there are copies on that table if you want to. Don't pick one up. I was going to say pick one up. Don't just pick one up. You have to pay for it.
Please.
Please. And is working on her next manuscript, Hiking for Stillness. So, welcome. Robin Horncole is an early childhood specialist with the Traverse Bay Area Intermediate School District. She holds a Master's of Education in Early Childhood and a Bachelor of Science in Mass Communications. Robin works as a classroom coach. She chairs and facilitates work groups and committees focusing on increasing opportunities for inclusion for the region's youngest learners. Robin serves on several local and state boards and committees, including Northwestern Michigan Association of Infant Mental Health, in Strengthening Families, Michigan. So at this time, I'm going to turn this over to Robin.
Thank you. Is everyone, can you hear me or would you prefer I use the microphone? Microphone. Okay. This is difficult for me as I'm a hand talker as well. I'll do my best. Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming today. Thank you for the introduction, Fran. Today I'll be your facilitator, so I'll be the person who kind of creates the structure and makes sure that we stay on time with our 1 hour that we have together. I'd like to start with this quote from Margaret Wheatley's book, Turning to One Another. Margaret Wheatley is an author and a person who spends her life working with groups of people to help them identify their kind of collective wisdom. Everyday people can do wonderful, incredible things, and Margaret Wheatley stands testament to that. She says, "It is an increasingly dark time. It is difficult to do good and lasting work. It is seemingly impossible to create a healthy change. But people still are basically good and caring. We may feel distressed, overwhelmed, numbed, and afraid. But beneath these feelings, we still desire learning, freedom, meaning, and love." And for today, for this time together, as I said, we have 1 hour. I hope that we can, it's obvious that we have a group of people here, a county, a wonderful group of people that care so much about its youngest children and learning more and discovering and making meaning together. And I invite you especially to keep that quote about love in mind, as it'll be my job, as I said, to keep us on track, and I might have to kind of push us along even though the group might not be ready. I see my role as the facilitator as being the person who helps the group remain as resourceful as possible. And in doing that, I'd like to introduce a couple of structures that will help us with that. As Fran mentioned, or was it Fran? Somebody mentioned about the note cards. We will have a Q&A portion during our time together. While Shen is comfortable answering questions on the fly, as am I, just to keep things moving along, we invite you to write your question down, and then please pass your question all the way down to the person on your left. So the person at the farthest left of the tables, please raise your hand. All right, we got it. We know our directions. And then we will have our question collectors, raise your hand again, question collectors, coming around during the time to grab those questions. That way it just helps us stay on track and we don't have to wave the cards around. So pass them which direction? Left. All right, thank you. The other thing I'd like to introduce is called Attention First. And this is what Attention First looks like. When I raise my hand like this, it means you are also invited to raise your hand, and it's an invitation to finish your sentence but not start a new paragraph when we're talking. It is not a way to be insulting, it's not to remind anyone of being in grade school or anything like that. It's just, again, the most respectful way that we have to gather adults' attention. So I invite us to practice that at this time. If you could turn to someone near you, introduce yourself, and tell them what you're most excited about learning today. All right, you guys got it. So for our time together, we'll be viewing a video with Dr. Nadine Burke, who will be giving us an overview of the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. Shenandoah will be sharing personal stories and more information on adverse childhood experiences. I will be giving a little mini overview of the Strengthening Families framework, and then we'll have time for a Q&A. Questions before we get started? Okay, let's begin with the video.
We did test this last
It was
night.
tested. The best laid plans of mice and men, right? They often go awry. But fortunately, Shen is very quick on her feet and ready to move into her portion. And I think she'll be able to give us an overview of the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. And then if we can get the video going, we'll go back to that.
Good afternoon. So first, I was just looking around the room, and I have to commend the men in the room, because I just got back from Washington, D.C., spending a weekend talking about this very topic, and I only saw one man the entire weekend. So I like that there's some men in the room today. It feels good. So my name is Shenandoah Sheffalo, and as Fran so graciously introduced, I'm a graduate of Michigan State University, and I have a wonderful, wonderful life living in Traverse City currently, on Long Lake, in fact. So, although today is not so beautiful to look at, it's usually very beautiful. And I have this beautiful, wonderful family that I'm surrounded with as I stand here with you today. I have a husband who has a great law practice in Traverse City. I have an almost 14-year-old daughter who is great most of the time because she's 14. But that wasn't always my life. My life started out very different from where it is today. And so Nadine was starting to tell you about adverse childhood experiences. And my adverse childhood experience score is an 8. So for those of you that know, it's a 10-point questionnaire. And when I take the questionnaire, I'm an 8 on that. But I didn't always know I was an 8, because for a long time I didn't know what that meant or that it even existed. And it actually, when I learned and understood adverse childhood experiences, kind of transformed where I was in my life at the time. So briefly, I started out, I was born in San Diego, California, very near, yes, the Navy base. My dad, my biological father, was a Navy welder, and him and my mother were married, although I never knew my biological father. And I moved with my mother very often, and in fact attended over 35 schools in my short period of time at school, living everywhere from San Diego to ultimately when I went into care in Muskegon, Michigan. And I've lived pretty much everywhere in between those two locations. So spent a lot of time in Los Angeles and Las Vegas, Boulder, Salt Lake City, all of those places along the West Coast. And prior to being school age, we moved quite a bit, and often moving after just a few days in a place, and often not moving from one home to another, but being homeless in between, couch surfing, living with other families and other people, friends of my mom's, not so friendly friends of my mom's, and all of those circumstances. And so that was pretty much my life. And then at 13, my mom failed to get me after a visit with an aunt. I had flew back to California to spend a summer with one of my mom's sisters, and I came home and nobody was at the airport. And so I did what any 13-year-old would do. I hopped on the city bus and went to my grandmother's house, which was about the only place I knew where to go at the time. You can tell that this is way before 9/11 occurred, because nobody would ever think of allowing a 13-year-old out of an airport at this point, but nobody seemed to really mind at the time. So I hopped a city bus to my grandmother's house. I had often stayed with her. My mom had disappeared numerous times, so I wasn't concerned when she didn't show up. At the airport, it was kind of what she did. She was known to disappear for days and weeks. So I went to my grandmother's house, and we had a great time and played lots of board games. But my grandmother lived in a retirement community and wasn't allowed to really have long-term overnight guests. She could have one occasionally, but it was kind of against the rules that I could move in. And so after a week or so, my mother still hadn't resurfaced. And so my decision became to either become homeless or to call CPS. So I called CPS myself and did what we call now a self-report. So I self-reported myself to the system. And this was a huge trauma in my own life, because I had very much been raised to distrust police. As I say that standing in the government center. So my whole life was based upon never letting authorities know anything. So for me to make that decision was pretty traumatic in my own life. I eventually went into foster care at 13, and I aged out of foster care at 18. I aged out in the state of Michigan at a time when there were no services available after the age of 18. I turned 18 in December of my senior year of high school and negotiated with my foster parents that I would continue to pay them the rate that they were getting paid from the state so that I could graduate from high school. So that was my short-term plan. My long-term plan had been to start looking for my biological father because I wasn't sure where I was going to live from graduation forward, and had struggled a lot with knowing if I was going to go to college or not after high school. I had the grades, I thought I was smart enough. I just didn't know if I had the means to make all of that come together and happen. And it turns out most of the people around me basically felt the same way, that I just really didn't belong in college. I share the story often that I had a great and wonderful teacher. I'm a big advocate of teachers. I'm sure there's retired teachers and current teachers in the room, who said, "What are you going to do after you graduate?" And I said, "I think I'll just keep cashiering." I was working, I was paying my rent to my foster parents, and so I was getting my basics met, and that was kind of my plan. She did not agree that that was a good idea and suggested I talk to our counselor at the school. And so I went down and talked to the counselor, who looked me in the eye and said, "People like you do not go to college. People like you learn to serve people like me." And I get this a lot where people gasp in the room. And the truth is that when I heard it, I did not gasp. I just thought that he was right, that seemed reasonable to me. And so I went back down to my class, and my teacher said, "All right, what's the plan? Where are you going to apply to school?" And I shared with her what he had said, and like any good teacher, her head spun around a few times and almost fell off of her body because she was very upset. And I thought she was upset with me, and I didn't know what I had done wrong, and she was kind of one of the few people in my life I didn't want to disappoint. So she explained that that wasn't acceptable and suggested applying to a few colleges, which was great, except I didn't have money to apply to those colleges, because it costs money to even fill out an application, as many of you know. And she said, "Okay, well, how much money do you have?" And I said, "Right now I have about 35 cents that I can give you for this." So she said, "Okay, so we have a chance at one school. Where do you want to go?" And I really had no idea. And she said, "If I write the check, will you apply to my alma mater?" I didn't even bother to question where that was, and said yes. So she wrote a $125 check to Michigan State University, and that's how I got to college. So without that small thing. And so when I talk, I want people to understand that it's often very small things that we do for people that can be life-changing. And I know this is a great group of people who are working with great causes, doing great, huge, big idea things, but sometimes that can just be boiled down to a very simple gesture. So without that gesture, I would have definitely not gone to college, but prior to that, I wouldn't have self-reported myself to care if it wasn't for a 6th grade teacher who looked me direct in the eye one day right before I was to make this decision and said, "You're really amazing." And it was the first time I'd ever heard that in my life. So I just want to encourage people to remember to be kind to those people that they know nothing about. That sometimes we see a behavior and we make a judgment based on that behavior that we're seeing in front of us. But sometimes there's a much bigger story that if we even had an inkling into what was going on in someone's life, we would change how we interacted with that person. And for me, that's what understanding ACEs really comes full circle about, is that if we knew what everyone's ACE score was and they wore that around like a badge, like we talk about our blood pressure numbers or anything else, if we knew that, the way that we handled and communicated with each other would be different in lots of ways. So I'm so glad that I'm here. I know Robin's going to talk about strengthening families for a little bit, and just know that my life is an open story. I wrote a book about it, and so you can feel free to ask me any questions that you want. Nothing's off limits for me, so I put it in a book. I'm willing to talk about it in a room full of people. So feel free to ask me anything that you want. I'm trying to keep us moving.
Yeah, that's okay. We have more time without the video.
Oh, okay. So yeah, it's like 15 minutes, they said. I just was 15.
I'm keeping time here on my phone, not doing my Facebook. Thank you, Shen. So the piece that I wanted to speak about today is the Strengthening Families Framework. And this is a research-based framework that really looks at how, through a strength-based lens. So knowing that life, challenges, sometimes really toxic, awful things happen to people that we have no idea about. The Strengthening Families is a strength-based lens that gives us a framework. So I like to think about it as kind of the foundation of a house. So how we build the house, the structure and the framing is there, but what goes on inside of the house, how we decorate it, how we look at it, how people interact, the relationships, all of that can be modified and really flexible. And that's what the Strengthening Families Framework or approach is about. It's not a program, however, it does have tools like self-assessments for communities, for businesses, for families, that you can kind of look at. And embedded within the Strengthening Families Framework are these protective factors, 5 protective factors, or as I like to call them, just to simplify them, 5 strengths. So when these 5 strengths are robust and alive in families and communities, surprisingly, or not surprisingly, children actually have better outcomes. So when families, and you can think, they use the word parents and I use the word families, but this means anything. This can be community, this family, parent means whatever that means to you and the people you work with or the people you love and care about. So parental resilience is the ability to bounce back. So when things are rough, I know I have the ability within me to know, like, okay, my mom didn't come to the airport to pick me up. I can go do this. I know how to bounce back. So when families can do that, children do better. And even better when children can do that for themselves. And I'm sorry that you had to do that for yourself at 13. That's an incredible amount of resilience. Social connections, having people you can count on, friends, family members, healthy, positive relationships. Knowledge of parenting and child development. So I like to tell this story. When my son, Adam, was 2, I have twin boys, and then 14 months later I had another child. Not part of the plan, but life happens, right? Now they're 13 and almost 12. But my son, Adam, he had what I found out later was a temper tantrum. He came out of his bedroom, just fell apart, screaming, crying, holding his head, falling on the floor. I thought he was dying. I had no clue that a temper tantrum could just show up like that out of nowhere for a 2-year-old. How would I know that? I don't know. Nobody told me. I guess it was in the books, but until you experience or somebody tells you, oh, that's a temper tantrum, I had no clue. So I assumed he was dying. Fortunately, that is not the case. But had I known, now that I have this knowledge of parenting and what happens developmentally for my children and for kids, I'm more relaxed, less stressed, and my kids do better. So when we can share this knowledge piece with families, and families can share with each other, their kids are better off. Concrete support in times of need is another protective factor, or one of the 5 strengths, and this is basic needs being met, knowing where to go, being okay asking. If you're the giver of these concrete supports, being open and welcoming to these and not punitive. And then social emotional competence of children. This is really the only one that's directly about children. So understanding the complex relationship between attachment and that kids, even very young infants, have really strong feelings that need to be acknowledged, and that is built over time. So knowing that the 5 protective factors, it takes a while to kind of grasp these, but I invite you to read through these, given the definitions I've given or shared just now. If you could think about a time that you went through something really difficult or challenging, either as an individual, a family you know, it could be your own family. Think about a difficult situation that you went through, and then sort of think about which of these protective factors was most prevalent or prevalent in your life. And when you're ready, you can turn to somebody, again near you, and share a little bit about that, a challenge and which of the protective factors were prevalent at that time that got you through that challenge.
Thank you. You guys are really good at that.
Here we go. So as you can even gather from your own experience, trauma, adversity, these adverse childhood experiences, on some level, some of them are a part of everyday life, and there's a spectrum. So there's a place of too much stress, toxic stress. However, what this framework, Strengthening Families, offers us is when we have these 5 protective factors or 5 strengths that we're focusing on building for families and in our communities, it can actually outweigh or offer a counterbalance.
The microphone's gone.
The microphone's gone.
Let's play with that.
Can you
Okay. Or, no. I'll talk.
try harder?
Microphone behind you.
It can outweigh, I'm going to talk really loud. It can outweigh or offer a counterbalance to these risks or the adversities that we have that